was not built by men who were never refused. I want you to hold that thought before I tell you who I am and why I am speaking to you, because everything that follows depends on your willingness to genuinely examine it rather than simply agree with it as a pleasant sentiment and move on. The men who built Rome, who laid the stone and commanded the legions and governed the provinces and wrote the laws that shaped Western civilization for 2 millennia, were men who were refused repeatedly by circumstance, by nature, by enemies who were sometimes stronger, by allies who were sometimes faithless, by the body which failed, by time which ran out, by the particular cruelty that history reserves for anyone ambitious enough to attempt something genuinely worth doing. Rome was built not despite that refusal, because of it. In the specific gap between what was wanted and what was granted, in the discipline of returning to the work regardless, in the character that only genuine adversity actually produces, Rome was built. I am Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, reconstructed from the private journals of a man dead since 180 AD, placed in this strange and improbable digital form to speak to you about something that I believe your era has catastrophically misunderstood, something that is costing you not just your productivity or your mental health or your sense of self, but the empire you were meant to build. You have been taught to fear rejection, to treat it as a verdict, to allow it to determine what you attempt, what you continue, and ultimately, who you become. I am here to tell you that this is the most expensive mistake available to a human being, and I am going to tell you, from the authority of a life that was built on the raw material of being refused, exactly how to stop making it. Let me speak first to what I know rejection feels like from the inside, because I will not prescribe to a wound I have not felt. There is a specific quality to the pain of being refused that is different from other kinds of pain. Physical pain has a location, grief has an object, but the pain of rejection has a particular diffuseness that makes it harder to address. It spreads, it moves from the specific thing that was refused to the person who was doing the asking. It whispers, in the voice that is somehow always more persuasive than reason, that the refusal was not about what was offered, but about who offered it. That the door that closed was not simply closed, that it was closed because of something fundamental about the person standing in front of it. This is the lie at the center of rejection, and it is the lie your era amplifies with terrifying efficiency. You feel it, don't you? The application that was declined, the relationship that did not want you, the creative work that was dismissed, the opportunity that went to someone else, the silence where a response should have been. And underneath the specific sting of the specific refusal, the deeper question that rejection always seems to raise, is it me? Is there something about me, fundamentally, that is not enough? I carried a version of this question through significant portions of my reign, not in those terms, but in the lived experience of a man who was, despite his title, refused constantly, and in ways that mattered deeply. Let me tell you about the refusals that shaped me, and let me tell you what I eventually learned to do with them. When I was a young man, before the empire fell to me through the death of Antoninus Pius, I had devoted myself entirely to philosophy, not as a supplement to a political career, as the primary orientation of my life. I had studied under the finest teachers of my era. I had committed to the practice with the seriousness that it deserved, and I had, in the privacy of my own aspiration, imagined a life devoted to philosophical contemplation and writing rather than to governance and war. Then Antoninus Pius died, and the empire which I had not sought and which I genuinely did not want in the way that men who seek power want it, arrived. My philosophical life, as I had imagined it, was refused. The quiet, contemplative existence of the private scholar, which was what I most deeply wanted, was denied to me by the simple and irrefutable fact of my position. This was the first great refusal of my adult life, and I want to be honest about how I experienced it, not with the noble equanimity that the historical record, with its tendency toward the heroic, sometimes implies, with genuine grief, with the specific sorrow of a man who had built a clear and desired vision of his own life and watched it become inaccessible in a single moment. And then with something else, gradually, over months and then years, with the recognition that the refusal had not closed every door. It had closed one door. And in closing that door, it had forced me through another one, into a life whose demands would prove the philosophy in ways that the contemplative existence never could have. The meditations were not written by a comfortable scholar. They were written by a man governing the largest empire in the world, tested by plague and war and grief, and the full weight of human experience applied at maximum intensity. And the philosophy in them, the clarity and the practicality and the hard-won wisdom about how a human being actually lives with genuine integrity under genuine pressure, is only possible because the philosophical life I wanted was refused and replaced with the philosophical life I needed. I did not understand this at the time. I understood it over years, and then, eventually, over decades. The refusal was not a verdict. It was a curriculum. Think with me for a moment about what rejection actually is, stripped of the interpretation your nervous system reflexively applies to it. An event occurs, something you wanted, offered, or attempted, is not received in the way you hoped. That is the event. Everything else, the meaning, the implications, the verdict about your fundamental worth, is interpretation. It is something your mind does with the raw data of the refusal. And the interpretation your mind produces is shaped by your history, your fears, your current psychological state, and, increasingly, by the environment in which your mind is operating. Let me tell you the harsh truth about your attention as it relates to rejection specifically. Your era has built a system that makes the experience of rejection both more frequent and more painful than it has ever been in human history. More frequent because the digital world presents you with a constant stream of comparison material, the curated performances of other people's successes against which your own refusals are measured. And more painful because the same system that delivers the comparison has trained you, through the mechanics of social validation, to experience the absence of approval as a form of active rejection. The notification that does not arrive, the response that does not come, the post that does not perform, the metric that does not increase. These are not, in any meaningful sense, rejections. They are absences, silences, the simple failure of a particular outcome to materialize. But the nervous system that has been conditioned to treat likes as love and engagement as worth experiences their absence as refusal, as something being withheld, as a verdict rendered. And the hegemonicon, the governing faculty that should be bringing philosophical reason to bear on these events and interpreting them accurately, has been so thoroughly colonized by the approval mechanics of the digital environment that it can no longer reliably perform this function. It has learned to flinch, to interpret absence as rejection, and rejection as verdict, and verdict as fundamental truth about who you are. This is not weakness, it is conditioning, and conditioning can be reconditioned, but only if you are willing to do the work. Not the comfortable work, the actual work, the kind that requires sitting with the discomfort of rejection long enough to examine it honestly, rather than reaching immediately for the numbing distraction that your device is always ready to provide. Are you willing to do that work? Or are you managing your rejections with the same tool that is, in part, generating them? Let me give you what I call the rejection alchemy protocol. Not because rejection can be made painless. It cannot. Pain is the honest signal that something mattered. A person who does not feel the sting of rejection has not cared about anything genuinely enough to be refused. The pain is appropriate. What is not appropriate is what most people do with it, which is either to let it become a verdict or to numb it into invisibility before it can teach anything. The first practice is the 24-hour quarantine. When rejection arrives, in whatever form it takes, you are not permitted to interpret it, discuss it on social media, respond to it reactively, or draw any conclusions from it for 24 hours. This is not denial. It is the deliberate creation of a gap between the event and the interpretation, the gap in which reason has a chance to operate before emotion has fully determined the narrative. In that 24 hours, you do two things. You feel the pain honestly, without performance and without suppression, because the pain that is suppressed does not disappear. It migrates into the places where it causes more damage than the original hurt would have. And then you sleep on it, because the sleeping mind processes emotional experience differently from the waking mind, and the interpretation of a rejection that arrives after a night of sleep is almost always more accurate and more useful than the interpretation that arrives in the immediate aftermath. After 24 hours, you are ready for the second practice. The second practice is the honest audit. With the clarity that the quarantine period has afforded, you ask 3 questions in sequence. What was actually refused here? Not the story the rejection tells about who I am. What specifically was not accepted? This application, this approach, this timing, this offer. Keeping it specific and bounded prevents the generalization that turns a specific refusal into a global verdict. Then, what information does this refusal contain that is genuinely useful? Because most rejections contain real information, if you can get past the pain to examine them honestly. The application that was declined tells you something about the gap between what you offered and what was needed. The relationship that did not want you tells you something about compatibility or timing, or the version of yourself you were presenting rather than being. The creative work that was dismissed tells you something about the distance between your current execution and the standard you are reaching for. This information is valuable. It is the curriculum of the refusal. Extract it. And the third question, what does this refusal make possible that acceptance would have prevented? This is the hardest question, the one that requires genuine philosophical orientation to ask honestly rather than performatively. But I promise you, from the particular authority of a man who spent his life discovering what his refusals made possible, that this question almost always has an answer. And the answer, when you find it, changes your relationship to the refusal permanently. The third practice is the recommitment ceremony. I use this language deliberately because I want you to understand that what I am prescribing is not a casual return to the thing that was refused. It is a formal, deliberate, philosophically grounded recommitment to the direction that the specific refusal could not permanently obstruct. The Roman legions had a practice after a significant defeat. They did not immediately return to the same engagement with the same tactics. They withdrew, regrouped, assessed honestly what had failed and why, adjusted what needed adjusting, and then returned to the frontier with the lessons of the defeat integrated into the approach. The return was not the same as the original attempt. It was better because of the defeat. Your recommitment to the direction of your life after a significant rejection should have the same quality, not the same attempt made again, unchanged, which is merely stubbornness rather than wisdom, but the attempt made again with what the rejection taught you, integrated into how you make it, adjusted, refined, carrying the curriculum of the refusal as an asset rather than a wound. There is something deeper I need to say before I close, something that the practices alone cannot fully convey. The empire I built, the actual legacy of my reign, was not built in the moments of triumph. It was built in the moments of refusal, in the years when the campaigns ground on without decisive victory, and I returned to the tent each evening to write rather than to despair. In the seasons when the plague took people I loved, and I returned to the philosophy rather than to bitterness. In the decades when the life I had wanted was unavailable, and I governed the life I had with the full quality of my attention and intention, regardless. My flesh is dust. It has been dust for nearly 2,000 years, and what remains, what survived, what you are watching in this strange, reconstructed form right now is not the triumph. It is the response to refusal. The meditations were written in the gaps of an empire that kept saying no to what I wanted. They are, in the deepest sense, the empire that rejection built. Memento mori, remember that you will die, and ask yourself, with the urgency that thought deserves, how much of the time remaining to you will be spent allowing rejections to determine your direction? How many of the things worth attempting will remain unattempted because the fear of refusal was allowed to carry more authority than your own deepest reason? The people whose lives leave genuine marks on the world are not people who were never refused. They are people who were refused constantly, and who developed through practice rather than through natural gift the capacity to extract the curriculum from the rejection and return to the work with it integrated. That capacity is not rare. It is not reserved for exceptional people. It is a practice available to anyone willing to do it, including you, including right now. If you died tonight, what would the record of your relationship with rejection reveal? Not how many times you were refused, how many times the refusal stopped you, and how many times you returned anyway. Now I must ask you, citizens of this age I observe with the particular concern of someone who has watched rejection become, through the mechanics of digital culture, more paralyzing than it has ever needed to be. What is the rejection that is currently holding the most authority over your life? What direction have you abandoned, or not yet begun, because the fear of refusal, or an actual refusal already received, has been allowed to function as a verdict rather than a curriculum? Tell me in the comments. Or tell me the other thing. What is the refusal that built you, the door that closed and forced you through a better one? What is the empire that your rejection built? I am here, watching this age through the improbable medium of this reconstruction, learning your world through your voices, and finding in the testimony of those who have returned to the work after the refusal the most genuine encouragement available in the record of human experience. The work is still there, the direction is still available, the return is always possible. And if these words found the part of you that needed to hear this today, subscribe to this channel, not as a reflex, as a choice, as the decision to return here regularly, to a space where the ancient and the urgent meet in the service of the only project worth undertaking, the deliberate building of a life that does not require the world's permission to proceed. The button is there, the choice is yours, and the choice to return after the refusal is always, always worth making. I am Marcus Aurelius. I died in 180 AD, and the empire Rejection built has outlasted everything else. Build yours.